Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully those online can hear me, and hopefully you can hear me as well. We're privileged to have Dr. Brendon Benz with us for 4 weeks. This is week 3, and as you know, he's with William Jewell and the Center for Faith and Culture, and also professor of Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, whichever term you prefer. So please welcome back Dr. Brendon.
Great to be back, as always. It's great to be back. It's great to be back. It's good to see you all. Been watching basketball?
Oh, yeah.
Good. Yes.
Rock Chalk Jayhawk. I watch it every night and I wear it every day.
Good. Die-hard fan here. Purdue. Yeah. Oh, really? Boiler up. My brother did. I'm from Indiana, so die-hard fan. You have to be. You have to be both basketball and football. Well, last week, so the first week we talked about different methodologies for approaching the Bible, right? And different kind of lenses that we wear when we read the Bible. The week after, last week, we talked about the Enuma Elish and the points of, well, the context out of which Genesis 1 emerged, and some of the confessional points that we can take from understanding the context. Any questions about that?
What do you mean by confessional points?
Great question. I had a student ask me that today. It means readings that contribute to a life of the life of the church. I think it means, you can help me out here, Mike, but and so it means really taking the academic and practical and making it practical. How does this inform the way we live? Right? How does this inform the way we live? Paulo Freire has a great book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Some of you may have read it. It's very slim. I highly recommend it. And one of the best footnotes I've ever read was his discussion of praxis. He talks about the difference between verbalism and activism. Verbalism is speaking, thinking without doing. Activism is acting without putting thought into it. And he says praxis, real praxis, is verbalism plus activism. And there, I think, I may have said this before, but Mike's probably aware of this distinction in seminary where there's systematic theology, you can study that track, and you can study practical theology. And there's always this kind of arrogant privileging of systematic theology. But after going to seminary, we came out, my colleagues and I, talking about practical theology and impractical theology. I think you'll appreciate that. So putting things into practice. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
A couple key terms. Any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, I just think it's really academic when you say your favorite footnote.
My favorite what?
Footnote.
Oh, yes.
Who else reads footnotes?
That's right. Yeah, that's too bad. I'm going to have to make up for that. Funny. Okay, well, here's some more academics for you. A few key terms that we didn't cover. Cosmology, which is the creation of the universe. We saw that the universe is created by Marduk through the disemboweling and dismembering of Tiamat. Another key term is cosmology, right? Which is the structure or the shape of the universe. In the ancient world, the ancient Hebrew world looked like this. You have the firmament above and the firmament below. It's flat earth. And it rains to the top, but there's also waters below. And so if you saw the Flood movie, I've never seen it, the most recent one, apparently there's a scene where water starts spouting out from the ground, and that would be a legitimate picture of what was being envisioned. Water, in this case, symbolizing chaos and overtaking the created world. And then the third key term is cosmetology, which of course is the art of applying makeup. And you can see from this slide that there are 4 main categories: hair, skin, nails, and then just plain business. Okay? Good questions about that? Okay, thanks.
They have a school for that.
They do, yeah, they do. I clearly did not go through it. Knowledge is what? Knowledge is, oh, we're good. Remember that. Today we're going to practice this confessional reading. Looking at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3, which we know are not related. They stem from different schools of thought, and they're responding to very different circumstances and situations. But that doesn't imply that we can't read them together and in tandem. Follow? They sit side by side in our sacred text, so they should be read in tandem. And they reflect this dialogical approach, this call to be engaged in dialogue, even when we don't agree on everything. That's one of the underlying logics of the Bible itself. It includes contradictions, and one side is not privileged over the other, but they're in conversation with one another. Make sense? So the key question that we're going to ask ourselves tonight is this very important one over which much ink has been spilled, much discussion had. What is the image of God? Because it's this image that sets us apart from the rest of the created world. Excuse me. And it was seen that if we bear the image of God, we should pursue it to be able to experience a full life. Yes? God intended us to live in the divine image. Does that make sense? So there's these few passages, few verses that mention the divine image. My question is both, on the one hand, what have you thought the divine image to be? Because it's not identified. It's God's likeness. It's God's character. But what is that precisely? Or can we put our finger on it? So what have you believed in the past or been taught in the past or thought in the past that the divine image is? And then think about Genesis 1 and even the wider biblical context. What is the divine image? Like, what is God's likeness or God's character as it's demonstrated in the first chapter of Genesis? Does that make sense? Okay, so have at it.
I think it says be fruitful. I mean, he says that to the humans and multiply, whether or not that is children or works or whatever. I think creativity is one of his.
Absolutely agree. Here's what I'm going to do with this. Creativity is that. Excellent. In fact, we know that's God's character because the whole chapter is talking about God doing what?
Creating.
Yeah. So that's a core element of God's character. Yes.
I think that in the context of Genesis 1, focus on creation, but for determining the image character of God, we have to follow through the entire Bible.
Yep.
Or a collection of books in the Bible that tell us how God behaves, whether on his own behalf or Jesus on God's behalf. And so I think that it's an expanding definition that you cannot simply take from Genesis 1 or 2.
I think that's right. I think this character will be reflected in the and emphasized as the text unfolds. That's right. And I want to come to Jesus in a minute. Not first, but I've already done that. But yes.
If I remember right, it was something like 144 different.
Okay.
And so I think we need a really expansive image of God.
Yes.
So it's wisdom, it's women, it's Sophia, it's water, it's sunlight. I mean, it's everything that makes up the world.
Okay. Interesting. I like that. Absolutely. Yep.
To me, the basic thing, the underlying thing, in addition to creation, would be love.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
or emotional. So
Or what?
emotions.
Emotions. Very good. So why love? So let me circle around here a little bit. Why why love? Why emotions? What does love and emotions apply about God? Compassion. Okay, what does compassion mean?
God is constantly considering forgiving people,
Mhm.
individually as a whole. God is constantly reaching out to people in conversational ways in the Bible and asking those people to act well on behalf of others. And eventually asking people to forgive them several times.
Good. Forgiveness. Compassion means feeling with, right?
I think it's relationship.
Yep.
God wants a relationship.
That's right. Look at this text right here, right? Now there are historical critical ways to interpret this text, right? There's such things. There's a divine council in the ancient world, and maybe God was interacting with the divine council. But what else might this imply? Let us make humanity in our image. The implication is God is inherently relational. Yes, God is inherently relational. I think that's right. Yes.
Why is it plural?
That's the question, right? That's the question. So there is, in the ancient world out of which this text is stemming, there's this notion that the God is surrounded by the divine council. And so God could be conversing with this divine council. People might call those angels or demigods or whatever it might be. There's different ways to conceive it. But in the Christian tradition, Christian orthodoxy, we talk about God in terms of what? What is the nature of God? Yes, and Trinitarian, that's exactly right. Triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, right? Now, I'm not saying that this is a statement about the Trinity, right? But we can read the Trinity into this. I think that's fair. We can read the Trinity into this. And you, what was your name again? Sorry. Marita? Marita. Good. You were saying Sophia, wisdom, this is a characteristic of God. In Proverbs 8, Sophia, or wisdom, dances with God. And in that dance, creation is made, right? So God is relational, and this is picked up in John 1, where the Word was with God, and things were created through the Word. So that's how I would read it tonight. But whatever that means, because I can't wrap my head around what the Trinity is, I'll just be honest with you. But whatever that means, God is inherently relational. And we see that in the incarnation, right? In the Christian church, the incarnation is sort of the key component. And it's God deciding to become human in order to better relate to humanity. Right? Can't know human joy or human suffering outside of being human with humanity. Yeah? Does that make sense? Yes.
I've just been converted to a Jeffersonian theist, because to me that says God created me to be a creator and turned it over to me. Said, go ahead and here, it's what I created, now it's yours to create.
That's right. Right? So part of our very being is being creative. If we are living in the divine image, part of that is being creative, right? Does that make sense? Which gives work and vocation a whole different meaning if we take that seriously. And we'll return to that, yeah.
I think in some ways in our narcissism, we're creating God in our own image.
We may be. But I think there's enough from the rest of the text, right? The Bible, to support kind of these general parameters. Does that make sense?
Yes, except that they would be the same parameters as man. And so if those are the same parameters, maybe we created God in our image, God would have those parameters as well.
Right, and so now we're talking about how God is interacting with humanity, communicating with humanity, and I would acknowledge that my mind can't fully comprehend the divine, but that if God's communication with humanity is efficacious, then there are certain things that we can come out of it. Does that follow? No. It's a good question, though, because we always should be weary of what we identify the image with. I'll give you an example, or I'll show you why. Let's see. This is what traditionally the image has been identified with. And I've briefly discussed this before. Aristotle suggests that humanity is set apart from the rest of the created world. This is his great chain of being, because humans have a rational soul, which makes sense. We also have a nutritive soul, which helps us grow, and a sensible soul, which allows us to access the external world, like animals. And then he breaks the rational soul into three components: philosophical wisdom and practical wisdom. Philosophical wisdom is the wisdom to know concepts like financial solvency. We could probably list the things with financial solvency, or every triangle has three sides and three angles that add up to 180. Is that right? I don't really believe in math. And then practical philosophy, or practical wisdom, is being able to implement what you know is true. So if you know what financial solvency is, you know I shouldn't buy a brand new pickup truck, especially this day and age, even though I really, really want one. Unfortunately, I drive a pickup truck that looks just like a Prius. But then this third part is this deliberation, right? So you may know what is right philosophically, and you may know how to do it, but if you don't have a strong deliberative element of your soul, then you just won't make the right choice. So reason makes sense. Identifying reason as the image of God makes sense, because that is what sets us apart from animals. I think animals do have some reason. My dog has none, but I think some do. Okay. But what happens is we've identified that, and that's picked up by church fathers. Oh yeah, if you have a strong deliberative element, you have prudence. If you don't, he writes, you're incontinent. I could make a joke about that, but I want to be invited back. But guess who has a weak deliberative element of their soul, and guess who lacks a deliberative element, according to Aristotle? Who has a weak one? Females, you got it. Females, of course. And who lacks it? The barbarians, the other, anybody who's not us. This is picked up by people like Augustine. Same paradigm. He uses a little bit different language. And he uses this then to, I would argue, to create God in our own image, because it's the rational who are usually in that society have the power, the resources, the wealth to define reality. And talks about how because woman was created second and from man in Genesis 2, that means she only has part of man's reason. And guess which reason she was given? It's either contemplative or active. You bet. That's right. They lack contemplative. The result being this. On the Trinity, Book 12, Chapter 10, he writes, these are not my words, the woman is not created in the image of God. The woman can only image God if she's married or becomes man-like. Augustine, our big fan, our big church father. So I think you're right. This is an example of where we need to be very cautious, because this has been used to justify the subordination of women and justify slavery, quite frankly. There's an author called, or there's a pastor from the First Presbyterian Church in New Orleans called Benjamin Palmer, before, during, and after the Civil War. And it's like he is repeating Aristotle and Augustine and St. Thomas of Aquinas on these matters to justify the South's call to preserve slavery for the benefit of these poor individuals who lack wisdom, and if they didn't have the guidance of the benevolent master, they would run awry. You follow what I'm saying? It's bad. So I want to be cautious, but I want to see if we can get some ideas that are broad enough to be a guidepost for what it looks like for us to live in a way that flourishes, or the good life, yes.
I have a question, just in the words, at least in this translation, it says he created humankind in his image, male and female. But, so where does Augustine get his thinking that?
What's that?
From the Platonists.
That's right. And so he has to, this is trying to force that circle peg in the square hole, right? Or the cylinder peg. And he has to do some acrobatics, like saying Genesis 2 is a more expanded version of Genesis 1. So this is kind of the outline. And Genesis 2 is the more detailed version. His friend Origen, who lived several centuries before him, talks about how Genesis 1 was the creation of humanity before the material world. And then Genesis 2 is after the fall from the heavens. But you're doing acrobatics, right? And we all do that. I get it. We all do that. We all impose our paradigms on it. But sometimes some paradigms are much more like, what do you call it, contortionist than others, you know? So you're right. What does the image constitute? I don't think I've said it here yet, but to be clear, I think the author is using male and female, maybe I have said it, as opposites. Like for him, and it's probably him, he's thinking, what are the two opposing things that I could put here? Does that make sense? And I think I've said before, if we would rewrite this, it would be Republican and Democrat, right? Chiefs fan and Raiders fan. Okay. Does that make sense? So this is not a statement, at least for me, it's not, okay, I'm just gonna say I don't think it is. It's not a statement about gender or orientation. It's a statement about diversity. Follow that? Okay, sorry. You know, my periphery is very sharp. What does God have to do to create? Or what does God have to do to incarnate? Yeah.
Basically, he's got to motivate us to do something.
True. Yes. We are involved in the process. I agree with that completely.
Have some vision.
Yes, vision, absolutely. What's Paul saying this in the old hymn in Philippians? It's Philippians, right? Though Jesus was equal with God, what does he do?
Gives up his divine nature.
Very good. God self-limits. God self-limits. You follow this? So if God were occupied all space, theoretically, now we're jumping into the theoretical, if God occupies all space before the moment of creation in Genesis 1, then God, this will come as a shock to you, right? Is this God? No, good, it's not God. Is the owl God? Here's the shocking part, and I God. No, well, no. So there is,
He's a God in you.
yes, this is true. But so God has to create space for creation to exist. Yes.
Desmond Tutu referred to people as God carriers.
Yes. Image bearers, right? I think this is where this comes in. So I'm going to propose God self-limits. Is God compelled in any way to create? Okay. I will propose God is free. All that. This is my proposal from Genesis 1 and informed by the incarnation. God is a being who freely self-limits for the purpose of engaging in relationship. And when that occurs, inherently, creation emerges. Sunlight emerges. Does that follow? Now, put this together with the statement that the image of God consists of a plurality.
What through the logic on that? Self-limits creation.
Yes. Well,
What is the logic?
if God is all things everywhere, pre-creation is assumed. God has to create space to be able to say, let there be something that is not me. And that space, so when God creates humanity, God creates something that occupies space and thought that is not God. I presume that God could choose to occupy all space. In the same way, when God chooses to become human in the person of Jesus, God chooses to limit the divine self. Jesus was not omniscient, right? There were many times that he didn't know what was happening, what was going on. He was wise. He wasn't omniscient. Jesus was not omnipotent, right? He showed his power on the cross. Jesus was not omnipresent. God's not immutable because God becomes humanity. God becomes human. So those are all the limitation of traditional perfections, all of which stem from the Greek philosophical tradition. And God is subverting that and saying, this God, me, I choose to self-limit so that I can engage in relationship. Why is that necessary?
If God self-limits and wants the space occupied, that goes to the heart of God choosing isolation.
Community. What is the image of God? It is, that's right. So this is how I read it. I'm not saying I'm right. Probably am. I'm just joking. God's image is not something that I as an individual possess. It's a thing that I pursue in relationship with others. It's not single individual images God. It's the male and the female, the Democrat and the Republican, Chiefs fan and the Raiders fan. That's when the image of God appears. And when does it appear? When I freely limit myself to engage in relationship. You know what I'm saying? You've hopefully all of you. How does a conversation between a Democrat and a Republican happen? Yes, usually because I want to say I'm right, right?
Because we usually want them to then change their beliefs to the way we do.
Right. The process of self-limitation means I'm open to the possibility that I'm wrong, and I'm going to listen to you. Doesn't mean I'm going to change, but I'm going to listen to you. That's self-limitation. When I engage in a conversation like that that's fruitful, God is there.
Yeah, for God to incarnate, God had to go through a human creativity process of birthing.
That's right.
So that's very self-limiting to God's power.
Yeah, and we forget about that. Like God was an infant.
And so some of the, I think, early Christian movements thought it was that the incarnation was illusory.
Yeah, that's right.
I think part of it is because we're with Judy Schaefer. I think we live a society, my belief system is that we live in a dual society. It's either off or it's on. So here you find the duality again. Your Christian reality consists of self-limits and being free.
That's
The
right.
divine image is both male and female. That's my belief system, is duality as far as off and on. That's how computers work. And I think in our universe, that's how we work at the moment.
I agree. I agree. And the irony is that duality sometimes combined, right? True freedom does not exist without some sort of limitation. The paradox of that. True freedom doesn't exist without some form of limitation. So when we do that, when we choose to freely self-limit in order to be relational, creativity emerges and God is imaged. And there's support for this in the New Testament, Matthew 18:20, when Jesus says, and every time, when 2 or 3 are you gathered in my name, read my character, right? My character, there I am with there. There I am with you. When we freely self-limit in the character of Jesus, who does this through the incarnation, then Jesus is being presenced. Does that follow that?
So if we have free will, we have free will because God has limited himself and he's given us free will.
Correct.
So if we exercise that free will in a method that destroys the relationship, we commit sin.
That's what I would with the image collapses. Do you want to say it or? Yeah.
Well,
Could you identify what person is talking in the room, please?
Yes.
yeah, it's Randy Irie.
Here, I'll just kind of summarize that. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, please.
To have free will, God needs to limit the divine self. Because God can't know what I'm going to do before I do it for there to be free will. It's already preordained. That takes away the free will. So then to practice that character of God, I have to limit myself. And when I don't, I'm destructive, right? And it severs relationship, and that results in what we call sin, or the collapse of the divine image, or I would like to call, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the fall into the self. There's really no fall in the Hebrew Bible. That's a Platonic term that's been imposed upon the text. But I do believe there's a fall into the self, right? That's the opposite of self-limitation. So then how do we read this in light of Genesis 2, right? I would contend that God models for humanity what it means to be in the type of divine image that God creates in Genesis 1. Make sense? So God creates creation, and God observes creation, and the first thing that God observes about creation is what? That it's what?
That's good.
That's Genesis 1. And it's very good at the end of Genesis 1, but this is this astounding, shocking statement in the middle of Genesis 2, which you would not expect from an omnipotent, omniscient God who knows all things. God looks at creation and God says, what?
He said the man needed a partner.
Right. Something is missing. The text says it was not good that the man was alone. Not good is a synonym for evil. God is acknowledging that something is not good. Does that make sense? That's an astounding statement because that's God's own creation. I'll do this. We can run through these quickly, but so what we have there, if God is acknowledging that it's not good for the man to be alone, that the man is not representing the divine image in solitude, yes? For the divine image to be complete, the man needs to have a partner. A partner. and then it's good. I said in our last meeting, or the meeting with the elders and deacons, quickly I'll define this. Let's see. God is practicing empathy, okay? What is empathy? It's the capacity to take on the perspective of another. That's where I'm arguing, that's where I'm saying the divine image is manifest, when people engage in empathetic interactions. And empathy involves both being attuned to both the voice and the actions of other people. We know how people are feeling, not just how they tell us they're feeling, but by looking at their posture. And empathy requires this face-to-face interaction. So this is this beautiful thing about when the Bible, I love it when the Bible confirms science, right? Because this is scientific psychological studies. These are realities. This face-to-face interaction is necessary for empathy to occur. And God even talks about in the Exodus, God says, I've heard your cries, I remembered the covenants, and then I saw Israel in oppression, and I knew, which is this deep knowledge of their suffering. I knew it. So you see both hearing and remembering, seeing and knowing. So I'm assuming that God, if we enter into this narrative, God is seeing the posture of the man. There's no indication that the man said, hey, God, this is kind of messed up, you know. I wouldn't have done that, right? I mean, it's God. But God knows. God sees. A couple other points. Taking on the perspective of the other. There is self-oriented perspective taking where I put myself in the place of the other and I think, how would I feel? The problem with that is that usually results in a sense of anxiety in myself, and it causes me want to flee or to be antagonistic toward the other, right? There is other-oriented perspective taking where I really try to set myself aside. Impossible to do fully, but try to set myself aside and think about how do they really feel? And that's what encourages feelings of altruism, and that's what motivates me trying to serve the well-being of others. That follow? Two other points. One, empathy demands that we recognize the agency of others. We cannot solve their problems because it's usually my problem that I'm solving. They have their own problem. They have their own needs and their own wants. The second thing is that it's a really difficult process. You have to make a hypothesis about how they're feeling, go to that person, say, is this how you're feeling? And if you're anything like me, most of the time you'll be wrong. And then you go back to the drawing board and you think about it again. And then you go to them and say, how is this? Yeah, it corresponds a little bit more, but you're still way off. You get what I'm saying? It's a long process. Look how God interacts with the man. God saw that it was not good. If I am taking a self-oriented perception with this, and my creation is acting like it's not good, how do I respond? If I'm taking a self-oriented perspective, not other-oriented, self-oriented, if I put this dinner that I've worked so hard over in front of my boys, and because I'm often self-oriented when I'm around them, and they say, I don't like the food, how do I respond? Eat it! What's wrong with you? Right? That's so astounding that God recognizes, God acknowledges that it's not good for the man to be alone, and God doesn't get mad about that. And in fact, you know what's really ironic? The man's not alone because the man has whom? Has who? Yeah, sorry. The man has God. But the fact that the man is still lonely implies that God doesn't do what?
It wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough. God is not enough. God is not enough. No, he needs his partner to be able to engage with one another, and there God will be. Follow that? And then God decides, I'm going to solve this problem, but I'm not going to solve this problem in isolation. I'm not going to solve the problem of isolation in isolation. In fact, I'm going to invite the man to participate in the process. Give the man agency. And you've heard it before. Some of you have heard it before. God fashions something that has a pouch and long ears, and it's hopping, and it hops over to the man, and God says, "Here's your partner." And the man says, "Nope, sorry. But I'll name it kangaroo." God fashions, the man names, and in so doing, they create together, right? Freely self-limiting relationship produces creativity. And if you take seriously this trend, this line, it goes on and on and on and on, right? It's a myth. But we have to think about every single animal that God creates here. And every single time the man says, "No, but name it this. No, but name it this. No, but name it this." I've got like 2 no's in me. I'm not no's, like no's. I can't stand it. I don't like it. That's why I don't give my children the option of what they're going to eat. You're going to eat this, and there's no other option, right? God's patient because God is working with the man. God is partnering with the man. Does that make sense?
You got close with
What's that? Yeah, he did. He did. Best friend, yeah.
Well, this is Lance speaking, and it seems to me, though, that this implies that God had no idea what kind of partner man needed. And so he created these other animals which didn't fill the bill, which kind of says God didn't really know.
That's correct. God limits the divine knowledge. Could God have known? Presumably. Did God choose not to know? Yes, because it gives the man agency in the process. And by having full knowledge of what's going on, there's no relationship. Without relationship, there's no true creativity in this process. So God does limit the man. And that's what the text says. It says, God brought the animals to the man to see what the man would name them, implying that God did not know. God didn't know. Yes.
Back to Aristotle, the idea that Aristotle and others used the image of God to set woman aside as the lesser.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at God as self-limiting and recognizing the need for man to have a partner, doesn't, for me, for many, many, many years, I have not thought of God as male or female, but rather as amorphous and object. So it seems to me that it gives credence to the idea that God is both male and female and recognizes that man is half of that body and the other half is female. And so it means, again, translations are so important. So it leads me back to the idea that Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato corrupted the idea
Oh, yes,
of
yes.
God being male,
Yep.
so that we do not have to say that woman is not lesser, because it's a recognition within God that there are these types of nature that complement.
That's right, absolutely. I think you were saying that before, right? That gives us complementary characteristics. Absolutely. And here's the funny thing, right? So in the Bible, Yahweh is God and Yahweh is a he. Okay? And so when we see the pronoun for Yahweh as he, that's why. Make sense?
What do you mean Yahweh is the
Yahweh is a male deity in a polytheistic world where you have both male and female deities, right? And now we've moved out of that, right? Whatever that process was, we could talk about it sometime, but we don't recognize other deities. And so I think reading it in this way, you're right. It's Yahweh, God is both, and God is imaged in both. So think about this. I can't get this, but this is why I try to say I use God as opposed to the pronoun. Does that make sense? It's really clunky and it sounds funny and it's hard to get used to. But as a man, I've never thought about sitting in a church for years and years and years and hearing God referred to as he all the time. You follow that? But here's what I will tell you. Here's what I will confess to you. I remember the first time I heard a pastor talk about use the female pronoun for God. And you know how I responded? That's horse crap. Oh, no, I was raised in a very conservative Lutheran home. Okay. If I am that put off by the use of a female pronoun to refer to God, I can't imagine the impact it's had on women's consciousness. Is that fair to say? And so, yeah, you're right. This is God, and it's both talking in terms of sex and gender, but it's also talking in terms of the plurality of being. Because what does the Bible refer to Eve as? God doesn't create somebody who's, or God and the man don't create somebody who's like the man, but someone who stands in opposition to the man.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What, is that your own translation?
Yeah, that's right.
Because the NRSV and all the others don't do that. They do a helper, fit, suited, whatever.
That's right. Helper, the Ezer, it is a helper, Ezer, but that's been misused traditionally as one who does the service work, right? Cleans, cooks. The vast majority of the time the Hebrew word Ezer is used to refer to somebody, it refers to Yahweh, it refers to God. So this is a divine quality.
You know, Brendon?
Yes.
Brendon, this is Judy Schaefer.
Judy.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There's a comedian, Black. I can't think of his first name right now. But most of his comic stands, he says, Christians should not read the new Bible, the old Bible, because that is a text of the Jewish existence, and they never get it right.
Yeah, I don't align with that.
Well, you tell me what you're telling me tonight is much different than what I see when I read the Bible. So I'm very glad I'm at this class. Please go ahead.
Thank you. That's good. Yeah. The Bible, if I'm going to put my faith in something, it must be liberative. It must be liberative. And you're right, too often the Bible has been used in a negative way. Okay, God puts the man at rest, right? He puts him into a deep sleep. Why? Because I think God is saying, finally, after all the animals, God's saying, okay, I've got it. The switch has flipped, the light bulb has gone on, and he says to the man, chill out, relax for a minute. This has happened to you sometimes, and how liberative that is. You got this, I will let you take it. You know what I mean? The man sleeps because he knows that God's been listening, and he knows that God will make the right decision. And God tells the man to sleep, to rest, because the man's been listening, and the man's been speaking and giving his input, and God hasn't. Got it? And out emerges the woman, and the text says, the two were naked, but they felt no shame. Nakedness, of course, being a metaphor for vulnerability. Completely vulnerable, freely, self-limiting, being honest, being engaged in relationship, and they felt no shame. Follow that? Completely vulnerable, able to share everything. That's not the end of the story, but that ends up wrong. Here we go. I'm skipping ahead. Fall. So what happens in the fall? What happens in the fall? Remember, God says to Adam, shouldn't take this, but God says to Adam, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you do, you will surely die. And so we've traditionally read this act of taking the fruit of knowledge as a transgression of some boundary that God established, arbitrary boundary that God established. Make sense? I would suggest that instead of just, it's a prohibition that God gave to the man alone. He wasn't created yet. That God gave to the man alone. If you take possession of knowledge on your own terms, what does that do to any possibility for relationship?
It's the relationship.
It dooms the relationship. And when the relationship is doomed, what happens to the divine image?
It fails. It cannot be achieved.
That's right. It can't be achieved. Imagine the 2 millennia of time that the knowledge of what the image of God is has been taken possession of. Oh, it's human reason. And who's the most rational? Well, me, of course. What does that say about women and the other? Slaves. Subordinates. The irony of history is that the fall has been played out over and over with these types of interpretation of Genesis 1 and the image of God. That follow?
Prohibiting the man, per se, Adam, from accessing the knowledge seems really inconsistent with the idea of God who creates space in which man, beast, forest exist with collaboration.
That's right.
Forgive them the knowledge. So, Mike, is there some major flaw in the translation?
No, it's right. But so what did God and the man do throughout chapter 2? God said, "Is this good?" And the man said, "Not good." God said, "Is this good?" The man said, "Not good." Finally, God said, "Is this good?" And the man said, "Good." You can't think that Adam did not have access to the knowledge of good and evil. He certainly did. He certainly did. Whether he was aware of it when his posture said, "Man, you're great, God, but I'm kind of alone here," or when he specifically said, "It's not good, it's good." So it's not about accessing knowledge, it's about accessing knowledge in community. Because again, every time I take possession of it, I use it against you. That is my inclination. I can limit you to my knowledge of some element in the past, some element of your being, and I can thereby objectify you and control you. You follow?
So the Ukraine was never an independent nation per the nation of Putin right now, which we know is not true.
Yes,
It
correct.
was a nation before Russia.
Well, think about misinformation, right? We live in an era where we have misinformation frequently to control the minds of people for the benefit of those in power to the detriment of those who have none. Yeah.
I noticed in Genesis 2 that the serpent said something to Eve that was different than what God said to
Exactly
Adam.
right.
It was not only that you will die, but there was another statement before that, and I can't remember now what that was.
Perfect.
I'm curious.
The woman says, "We can't even touch it." She adds that. Were you going to say something?
I was just
No, sure.
asking. Were you talking about?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, what does that say about Eve's action then?
Good. Okay, perfect. Let's do this. Okay. This is an article, Bergner, who summarizes narcissism. So the opposite, as I understand it, the opposite of empathy is narcissism. We are all a little bit narcissist because we do feed ourselves, and that's a good thing. But this is extreme narcissism, right? It's extreme self-orientation. And he puts this theological spin on it. And I want to read Genesis 3 through this theological spin. There's 3 points that he makes. Narcissism, he says, begins oftentimes with a severance in relationship, a trauma in relationship. Makes sense? Profound relational injury. Profound relational injury. Think about this. The serpent says to the woman, "Did God really tell you that?" That's not true. God just doesn't want you to become like him. And I use him because that's a misrepresentation of God. God doesn't want you to become like him. Imagine the impact that thought that the woman has. God was lying to me. This is an arbitrary boundary, a relational injury that occurs. And then think about this.
Wait, how did the woman even know that if God didn't tell the woman?
Perhaps the man did.
So he wasn't really keeping the knowledge to himself.
No, true. But in this circumstance, look what happens. What does Adam do? Yeah. What does he do the whole time he's there? What does he say? Absolutely nothing. He's disengaged. He's distant. What's it like to have a relationship with a silent partner?
Much time to
Yeah. So we talk about, okay, Eve took it, but Adam said nothing. His culpability, his error is in his silence. They're equally at fault in this context, and we already begin to see the relationship is severing, right? There's no conversation. That's not necessarily what God said, or what does that really mean in the context of relationship? Or, hey, God and I participated in discerning the difference between good and evil together. I think we can do this together as well. Or, we've already done this together at one point or another. You follow what I mean? Oh, he's silent. It's breaking down. It's collapsing. Part two, there's such injury, personal injury, that they choose an object choice wherein the object is selected because it presents what the subject was, is, or would like to be. So because of this relational injury, the individual chooses an object to become, or a thing to become, a person to become. You follow? That means they're beginning to more and more to orient into themselves without the input of others. Think about this. It's right there. And the serpent says, if you eat the fruit, you'll be like God. Yeah, you'll be like God. And the woman looks, and what does the text say? Somebody read that.
So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate.
Yes. The fruit was what?
Good.
Wait a second.
She had the knowledge of good and evil as well.
She did. But she was using it in a way that in isolation, right? We can access knowledge of good and evil. The question is, do we access it in relationship in a way that images God, or do we access it in isolation? And every time we access it in isolation, it is used to do harm to others. I would wager that. Used to do harm to others.
Do you ever wonder what God envisioned would happen if they hadn't eaten the fruit? Broken the rules, we just stayed in that garden of Eden. I mean,
Yeah, so what would it be like? It would be, there would still be not good things, right? And there would be the partnership of humanity saying, that's not really good. And that's the person saying, you sure? Yeah, it's pretty much not good. Okay, let's solve this problem. Let's solve it together, right? This is what it would be. And as humans do that, moving around the world, there God is being imaged. There God is, to your point earlier, there God is, there Jesus is being imaged. Follow? And so maybe it's not about what could have happened, but what should happen, right? What should happen. Let me do one more point and return to that because that's really important. Yes, individual standards informing the choice. Oops, sorry. Tend to be out of reach. Thus, there is a restlessness in the person, and there is antagonism between others. You follow? I have this image of who I want to be. I can never attain it. I'm always working to get it. And I'm going to trample over you to achieve it. Follow that? And the eyes of them were open and they didn't die, but they knew that they were naked. All of a sudden, their vulnerability becomes their shame. And you know this. This is both on an emotional level and a physical level. We've all had experiences where we're vulnerable with others and where that vulnerability was used against us. Yeah. To conceptualize us, to attack us, etc. And that's knowledge that's being used. Does that make sense? Yeah.
The snake has knowledge as well.
Mm-hmm.
He has the knowledge that he won't really die, which is true.
The question is, what is death? So no, this is a great question. So life, creativity and life come from image-bearing humanity. Death, whether it's literal or figurative, comes from the severance of the divine image, right? This is what's happening in Ukraine right now. Whenever I limit somebody to one element of their being or something they did in the past, I am figuratively causing their death. And I want to, because I want to treat them as an object that I can control. And objects do not breathe. Yeah.
In the Garden of Eden, the death can be that they will be exiled for that simple, effective lifestyle.
That's correct.
Sent out into a world where the kindness and gentleness are not present, and all of the things they need to do are harder to achieve.
Right.
We have such a narrow definition of death.
That's right. And you've all experienced, or I hope not, but I'm sure we've all had that experience of the feeling of death, the emotional feeling of trauma and turmoil. And that is, that is just as death-like as anything else. Is that fair to say?
The death of a relationship,
Mm-hmm.
no matter who it's with.
That's right.
A friend, a family membership, a family member,
Right.
a love partner,
Right.
whatever. The death of that relationship is as devastating as physical death,
Yes.
and are involved with the engagement with each other.
Right. So that does bring up the question then, what does redemption look like? What does restoration look like? And I would suggest that the goal of restoration is the reestablishment of relationship by choosing to freely self-limit. And when we do that, we engage in communication, dialogue with one another, and the fruit emerges. Does that make sense? This is the image of Jesus. God self-limits in Jesus, and Jesus comes to the earth. Jesus manifests, incarnates in order to engage in this image-bearing relationship. An image-bearing relationship that reflects the one that God had with Adam. Makes sense? You're right. Exile. It's a common theme for the Bible. Lots of questions. So as I like to say to my students, Genesis 3 is not a historical event. I believe it's not a historical event. It's not this thing that happened that resulted in me being inherently fallen, right? It's not this stain, as an Augustinian would say, that continues on to the human line. It's rather like a play, and the curtain opens, and there I find myself standing at the foot of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, next to somebody that is standing in opposition to me, right? And my choice is either to climb the tree and throw the fruit at them, knock them out, be right, or to say, let's engage in this process together, let's dialogue together. I honestly believe if we took this seriously, the world would be pretty good. Pretty good. But I think if we could filter most violence if not all violence through this lens, it makes sense. Does that make sense? I'm over my time. Sorry. So next week, how does the flood narrative fit into this? And what does restoration look like in the New Testament? Okay. You don't have to agree with me.